We are living through a great choke point in the history of this country. What you saw in 2020 and its aftermath was a deeply Christian movement. The institutional character of Christianity is often rejected as part of the problem, a part of what has to be rejected, even though it is that institutional structure that has provided people with the ideological framework that enables them to judge it as evil. Essentially, what Christianity has that Islam does not is a concept of the secular. Islam is a totalizing way of leading your life. I think Islam is uniquely indigestible for a secular mindset, and people don't want to admit that.
If you've ever wanted to ask one of our guests a question, now's your chance. Members get ad-free, extended and early access episodes. Plus, they can submit questions for upcoming interviews. Click the link in the description of this episode or go to triggerpod.co.uk to join us.
Tom Holland, welcome back to TRIGGERnometry.
Thanks very much for having me back.
It's been a while. It's great to have you back on the show. In the meantime, by the way, you and Dominic, who's also a recent guest of ours, have had tremendous success. So congratulations on The Rest is History. It's absolutely crushing. How are you handling your newfound fame?
Oh, I'm struggling. I'm really struggling. It's amazing. I mean, we never in a million years imagined that there was quite the appetite for history that there is. And so I'm happy not just for myself, not just for Dominic, but for history lovers everywhere, that they can be reassured that history, it really does seem to kind of tick people's boxes in a way that I had never, ever expected that it did.
Well, there are a lot of memes online that by the time you're 40 years old, if you're male, this is, a man by the time he's 40, he's either got to pick World War II or Roman history. Like, you don't have a choice, really. We like both. So it's great to have you on.
It's good to know. I think the meme I always had was that no male after the age of 40 reads a novel. And so maybe they turn to non-fiction, and history perhaps is a kind of obvious. And I kind of slightly sense that in myself. I read far fewer novels now than I did.
That's really true, actually, because I used to read, I was quite a voracious reader of novels, and the older I get, the more I veer towards non-fiction.
Yeah, so I was chair of the Society of Authors, and they prepared a report on this, the gender imbalance, how it operated, and they they dug into the stats, and it was genuinely the case that the older men get, the less likely they are to read fiction, which as a non-fiction writer was obviously good news for me.
It is indeed. Well, look, it's great to have you on. Your last book, Dominion, we talked about it last time. But it's something we want to come back to a little bit in this conversation and talk about the history of Christianity, but also Islam you've written about too. But starting with Christianity, I mean, the thesis of your book essentially is that Christianity is the soup we swim in the Western world. Yeah,
it's the water. We're goldfish, and Christianity is essentially the water that we're swimming in.
Talk to us, because one of the things I think very few people now understand is how remarkable the mentality shift that came with Christianity was, and how different Christian civilization is to the pre-Christian civilization in terms of its values, in terms of the things that it thought were important, in terms of the things that it believed about, you know, human beings and how they ought to act and what they ought to value and so on.
Yeah, I mean, it is radically different. But just to presage what I'm going to say about that, by pointing out that obviously nothing comes from nothing. Christianity emerges from a particular matrix that you get in first century AD Mediterranean. There are all kinds of influences on it, the Jewish most obviously, but also Greek, Persian, and the fact that it is born into the Roman Empire. I think without the Roman Empire, it would not have happened. And on the topic of the Roman Empire, I guess the clearest demonstration of the vibe shift, if you want to call it that, is to look at the classic emblem of Christianity, which is the cross. And the cross is, for the Romans, it's an expression of their right to torture to death anyone who opposes their rule. It is the fate that is visited, particularly paradigmatically, on slaves, because it is the most agonizing but also the most humiliating form of death imaginable. You are stripped naked. So, if you think of pictures of Christ on the cross, he usually has a loincloth. He wouldn't have had a loincloth. He would have, it would all have been exposed. And you are nailed or hung by ropes or suspended in a wide variety of ways. There's no kind of set way of crucifying someone. And you are then a kind of public spectacle. You're like a kind of billboard advertising the power of the state that has put you there. And you can be, you can't ward the birds off as they flock around your eyes and peck them out. You're constantly levering yourself up and down to try and keep your breath. Your suffering and your agony is on absolutely public display. And perhaps when you die, you're left there like a slab of meat. So it is an excruciating, agonizing, horrific death. And what Christianity does is to turn that value system on its head and to say that the person who is crucified triumphs over the person who's crucified him. And the scale of that value shift, I think, is illustrated by the way in which, in the early decades and centuries of Christianity, the fact that Jesus died on the cross is a cause of deep anxiety, or at least embarrassment, to Christians who are talking about it. So the earliest Christian writer that we have, the earliest evidence for Christianity, written evidence, is Paul. And in his letters, he situates the death of Christ on the cross at the center of what he is preaching. But he is also kind of embarrassed about it. And so he says that to the Jews, or the Judeans, as I'd rather call them, it's a stumbling block, his message. But to everybody else, so to the Greeks and to the Romans, it's just madness. And the reason for that is that for the Romans, what Paul is preaching, the idea that a man can also be a god, I mean, that's not news, because Julius Caesar had become a god. Augustus is worshipped as a god. That's not the madness of it. The madness is the idea that someone who had suffered this death that paradigmatically is visited on slaves is a god. That's the lunacy of it. And you sense that Paul is, constantly trying to preempt objections to that kind of position of madness. And it's something that continues throughout Christian writings throughout the 2nd century into the 3rd century. And even when Constantine, in the beginning of the 4th century, converts to Christianity, and Christianity starts to emerge as as something that is first of all permitted and then becomes kind of the state ideology, there's still a reluctance to illustrate Christ on the cross. And there's an ivory casket in the British Museum which illustrates various scenes from the Passion, and you have Jesus on the cross there. He looks unbelievably buff. He's got his loincloth on, and he looks like he looks like an athlete. He looks like someone who's winning first prize in the Olympics.
He looks like an Instagram influencer.
He looks like a footballer. He's kind of toned, he's muscular, he's relaxed. He's got this kind of completely mellow expression on his face. He does not look like someone who's worried about birds coming and pecking out his eyeballs. And so even there, you still don't have, the artist is reluctant to portray the reality of crucifixion. And it's not for another 500 years, not until just before the first millennium, that you get the first representations of Christ dead on the cross. And then over the course of the Middle Ages, so the High Middle Ages, the culture of Latin Christendom becomes increasingly obsessed with the sufferings of Christ. So it's portrayed in art, but it's also in the liturgy, it's in prayers, it dominates the Christian imagination. And I think that the long-term consequence of that is that we, as a civilization, people growing up in a world that's still powerfully informed by Christianity, we've been desensitized to what the cross represents. We see it as a kind of abstract expression of Christianity. We don't stop to think, That's that. People have said, oh, it's like having, the electric chair as a symbol of your faith. There's something of that. But it is much, much worse to be crucified than to die in the electric chair.
Tom, come back with me to what you said earlier, which I thought fascinating, because we talked about the moral inversion, the flipping of morality almost. And what we mean by this is effectively in the civilization in which Jesus was born and lived, the idea was that it was the strong conquer and win and the weak suffer what they must, or whatever that phrase is effectively, right? It's the ideology that Nietzsche then kind of reinstated later in the 20th century, which was this idea that, the strong must get what they want and the weak are going to suffer, and it's good to be strong and it's bad to be weak. And you say this was already there. It came from something that was already there in Roman society, in the Greek society, in the Jewish traditions that these people lived within. So how does that happen?
No, I'm not exactly saying that.
Okay, correct.
I'm saying that there are if you think of Christianity as a great sea, there are many rivers that flow into it. So there's the obviously the kind of the Jewish inheritance, the scriptural inheritance, and with from Greece there is the philosophical tradition. So the influence of Aristotle and Plato on Christianity as it evolves is absolutely immense. There's a sense in which a lot of theology is just kind of footnotes to Plato, like philosophy is. The influence of Persia. The Persians have this idea that the universe is moralized, that there are rival principles of dark and light, of lies and truth, and this seems to be a big influence on the formation of Hebrew scripture, because people from Jerusalem are taken as prisoners to Babylon, and then Babylon gets captured by the Persians, and they're allowed to go back and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. And Cyrus, the first great Persian king, is hailed in the Bible as a messiah, as a kind of a liberator. So that's also a crucial part of it. And then what Rome provides, I think, is the notion of a universal order. So the ideology of Rome is that they have imperium sine fine, as Virgil called it, empire without limit. The remit of Rome is universal. And that is something that Christianity kind of takes for granted, that there is a universal global order. And Paul's ability to, write his letters to the Galatians or the Ephesians or the Corinthians or the Romans reflects that. The Mediterranean has become a Roman lake. The shipping lanes can be used without fear of pirates attacking you, and roads are being built and you can travel on them. It's a globalized world, and so that also is part of the kind of the Christian context. The idea that someone who has suffered the death of a slave could in some way be the universal God who has created everything, that is the radical, that's what's novel, that's what's radical. Although having said that, I think when you look at Paul's letters, so the tradition of Paul, as it's embodied in the Acts of the Apostles, and Paul talks about it himself in his letters, is that he was a persecutor of the church. He obviously thought the Christian notion that Jesus had risen from the dead and was in some way a part of God was powerfully offensive. And then he has a vision of the risen Christ, he says. And I think in the aftermath of that experience, he goes away and he reads through the scriptures to try and make sense of what he has seen. And it's like being given being given the key to a detective story, where you go back and you realize that all kinds of things, you've been thrown off the scent. You've missed what the actual solution to the puzzle is. And I think that's the key that Paul is bringing to Hebrew scriptures. And he's realizing that all the promises that he had thought were contained in scripture, that a powerful warlord would come to redeem God's people, that actually that wasn't what the key was. The key was that the Messiah would come, but he would come as a man of sorrows. And so he is drawing on the inheritance of Hebrew scripture. It is there. But what Christianity does is to kind of enshrine it at the molten heart of the gospel, euangelion, the good news that Paul is preaching.
I really like that we've talked about the difference between the Christian God and the gods that preceded it. Because if you know anything about Roman gods or Greek gods from which they were based on, they come across as petty.
Do you think? I think they come across as unbelievably charismatic.
Really?
Both, surely.
Well, the
Vengeful?
charismatic pettiness, perhaps you might say. You see, as a child, I went to church and went to Sunday school, and I loved the Bible stories. I mean, I thought they were great. But I was always very much on the side of the great empires. So I was very much kind of team Pharaoh as opposed to Moses, and loved the Assyrians, loved the Babylonians, very much pro Pontius Pilate as opposed to Jesus. And one of the reasons for that was that I found their gods kind of more glamorous and exciting. So everything that the Hebrew prophets were condemning, they condemned the gods of Egypt or Babylon as so much stock and stone that it's, they're just great idols and things. I'd love an idol. I thought that was much more kind of glamorous than what we got in the church. And specifically, I loved the gods of Greece. I found them so much more charismatic. But you're right. I mean, they're terrible. They're awful. But in a way, a god like Athena seemed to me to correspond much more closely to how I felt the world was. She's very, very smart. She's also very violent. She encourages all the arts of civilization, but she's also unbelievably petty, as you say. If you offend her, she will inflict appalling things on you, but she looks after her own. And I kind of always felt as a child that if Athena had been a viable faith alternative, I would absolutely have gone for her. And I think the sense that the philosophers have, so going back to the 6th century, and then through to Plato and Aristotle and to the particularly the Stoics, that they are reacting as you do. That Plato famously says we shouldn't have poets in our ideal republic because the poets make you feel the charisma of these gods, and they are not worthy of being followed or worshipped, and that the true divine lies beyond these stories. And essentially, it's that understanding of the divine that Christian theologians then kind of adopt and bundle into the package. So you could, in that sense, say that the Greek gods, in a kind of weird way, are the malign step-parents of Christianity, that it's the rejection of them. I mean, in an Oedipal way, very appropriate. It's the rejection of the philosophers of that kind of quality of the Greek gods is there. And it's interesting. I mean, obviously, this is crucially a part of the context, again, into which Christianity is born. So when Paul has his vision of Christ, according to Acts, Christ says to him, Paul, why are you kicking against the pricks? Why are you kicking against what I'm giving you? And this is a phrase that comes from Euripides' great play, The Bacchae, which describes Dionysus appearing, and there are people who reject him. And the fate that is visited on them is terrible. So Pentheus, the king of Thebes, who is Dionysus's cousin, refuses to recognize his cousin as a god. I mean, as he would if your cousin turns up and says he's God, not going to have anything to do with it. And he suffers a terrible fate. He, his aunts go mad, roam the countryside, tearing cattle to pieces and throwing bits of flesh all over the trees and things. Pentheus tries to arrest them. Dionysus drives him mad. He dresses up as a Maenad, literally a raver, someone who goes to a rave. So he dresses up in whatever, the Maenads are wearing, kind of animal skins. He goes up to try and spy on his mother and his aunts, and they see him and rip him to pieces as though so he's a wild animal. This is obviously not what Christ is doing to Paul, but there are clearly resemblances between a god, say, like Dionysus and Christ that even Paul can recognize.
How often do you get the chance to access a world-class education for free? That is exactly what Hillsdale College is offering with its new online course, Athens and Sparta. Few rivalries in history have left as deep a mark as Athens and Sparta. One was the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and art. The other built a culture of strength, unity, and sacrifice. Dive in today at hillsdale.edu/trigger. Over 9 lectures, distinguished historians Victor Davis Hanson and Paul Ray guide you through the triumphs and failures of these cities, From the Greek victory in the Persian War, which secured freedom and democracy in the West, to the devastating Peloponnesian War that brought Athens' golden age to an end. You will get access to all the lectures, course readings, and quizzes completely free. Enroll today at hillsdale.edu/trigger. That's hillsdale.edu/trigger.
It's such a good point you made, because when I was reading your book and I was going over Greek and Roman history with the gods, the one word that stood out to me was cruelty. It was they're viciously cruel. Take the story of Prometheus. It gave fire to the human beings, doomed to have, I think it was an eagle rip out his heart every day.
His liver.
His liver to be ripped out. But then you contrast that.
He grows back every day and then the eagle comes back and rips it out.
Yeah, you know, he liked to die of offal. Anyway, but you had like Jesus, who, when he was dying, said to God, whilst he was suffering the most horrendous and brutal of fates on the cross, "Forgive them, Lord, for they know not what they do." That is a radical transformation, isn't it? That's a radical difference.
Yes, it's very radical. And you mentioned Nietzsche. I mean, this is what Nietzsche fixes on. I said how we've become desensitized to the cross. I think it's amazing that Nietzsche, who is the most brilliant of all atheist writers who have emerged in the West, he gets the cross. He gets what is radical and subversive about the cross to a degree that theologians haven't really articulated for centuries and centuries. You know, there is something of Paul's bewilderment and perplexity and shock at contemplating the death of Christ on the cross about Nietzsche. And he finds it repellent because he thinks that what he famously calls Christianity a slave religion, that it's a religion for the weak and the poor, and that its popularity is driven by the ressentiment, the not quite resentment, the kind of mingling of resentment and hostility that those who are weak feel for the strong. And Nietzsche thinks that the strong are healthy and that healthiness should be celebrated, and that if strength involves strapping up someone who has annoyed you to a rock and sending an eagle to devour his liver every day, well, brilliant, bring it on. Let's crack on.
But there's another aspect of Christianity which is very powerful. Where Konstantin and I went to Sicily, and we did a guided tour of these Greek temples and Roman temples. And one of the things the guide said to us was, this was a place, the temple was a place for the high priests. This was a place for the upper echelons of religious society, whereas the church is a place for everybody.
Well, I'm not sure that's entirely true. The temples and the shrines, say in Greece or Rome, particularly, let's look at Athens, the democracy in Athens. The temples are seen as, and the rituals and the rites that are practiced to keep Athena and the other gods happy, are fundamental to the health of the entire demos, the entire people. And unless you buy into that, you don't understand what makes a city like democratic Athens tick. So the power, the kratia of the demos, we translate it as people power, and we think of it as democracy. But democracy in English is a kind of, it's a false friend. It doesn't mean what it meant for Athens. We tend to think democracy is founded on rights. People have a right to a vote. So therefore, the fact that men in Athens had a vote and women didn't is offensive to us. This is not how it operated in Athens, because the role of the men and women, all those who are sprung from the soil of Attica, are part of a continuum that reaches back into the past, forward into the future, and is in a kind of relationship with the gods. So the soil, the people, the gods, this is a kind of, it's an ecosystem in which everyone flourishes and everyone has their role. And the role of men in this ecosystem is to keep the demos, secure the demos against external enemies, so to go out and fight against rival cities, and also to draw up the laws that will enable the city to prosper in the kind of the dimension of the mortal. But just as important, or possibly even more important, is the role of keeping the gods on side. And in that, women have a very, very important role. They provide, they weave the robes that every year is given to one of the two statues on the Acropolis. So every fourth year, there's an enormous one that goes to the statue of Athena in the Parthenon, and every year a slightly smaller one to the kind of the ancient wooden statue of the goddess. They feed the holy snakes on the Acropolis with cakes. They practice cults. So in the great festival of Dionysus, they welcome Dionysus in, and women go to a temple in the marshes to Dionysus, and there one of them has sex with a king, and nobody really knows what this involves, but I mean, it's clearly something's going on there. And the thing I love is that every young girl in Athens, when she becomes 10, goes to this temple of Artemis, who, like Athena, is a kind of terrifying goddess, virgin goddess, mistress of the beasts, she's called. And girls go out there, and we're told in the classical sources that there they turn into bears. And scholars debate what does this mean? I mean, is it a puberty ritual? Do they put on the robes of, the skins of bears or what? Nobody pauses to think, well, maybe they did turn into bears. But what if they did turn into bears? What if they did? They are then roaming with Artemis out in the wilds. They have experienced things that men have not experienced. And every man who marries a woman in Athens is marrying someone who's run with Artemis, who's run with the animals. And I think people believed that. And it gives a shiver of the supernatural and the weird to the functioning of Athens in its golden age that we find very difficult to get a handle on, because, of course, the instincts of historians are incredibly materialist. And even if they do believe in the supernatural, they don't believe in the Greek gods. But you've got to try and believe in them. And when you do, you see that it's part of the rhythm and the fabric of the functioning of the entire city. And this is why, in the long run, the philosophers are so threatening to that, because if you're turning around and saying, that's all rubbish, God is kind of perfection in some distant moral order or something, what role is there then for girls going off and turning into bears and running with Artemis?
Well, look, I'm no historian, but I'm fairly comfortable with the idea of women turning into bears every now and again. That is a familiar experience. But I was going to come back to Christianity, because one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is, from my personal experience, I was surrounded by a lot of Orthodox Christians when I was growing up. My family are Orthodox Christians. And one of the things I found quite incongruous was that there was a doctrine of what you're supposed to do, and then I'd observe people who
orthodoxy.
There was an orthodoxy that nobody actually did any of those things. They just talked about them. And one of the interesting things to me about Christianity is, I imagine, my Anglican friends, let's say, who are kind of very peaceful and docile, almost, you might say, and very kind and generous, etc. That is not the way that Christianity has been practiced through the centuries in some parts of the world. So how, the message of Jesus turning the other cheek and all these other things, that is not also the way that Christianity has been practiced throughout the ages either. There's been quite militant periods. There's been periods of internal persecution, of, all sorts of recrimination between different branches, etc. How does all of that happen?
Christianity, I think, is best thought of as a kind of great pulsing matrix of paradoxes. Paradox structures everything about it. I mean, we've been talking about one, the guy on the cross who proves to be greater than the person who's crucified him, the man who is also a god, and I guess that this is the kind of the Christian understanding of the divine, that in a sense paradox structures the inability of the human mind to contemplate the potency of the divine. And that being so, there are many, many different ways of structuring and understanding what it is to be a Christian. And a lot of these are generated by the fact that, and it's a crucial development that might not have happened, that in the 2nd century, there's a guy called Marcion who points out that the God of the New Testament seems quite different to the God of the Old Testament. The Old Testament, the God of the Old Testament, he's busy, King David holds a census and God goes ballistic and kind of wipes all the children of Israel out with a plague. There's a lot of smiting and that kind of thing going on. And now suddenly Jesus is saying, to turn the other cheek and put up your sword, and what's going on here? Right. And so Marcion's theory was that that the God of the Old Testament was essentially a kind of subordinate angel who had usurped the true God's role, and that Jesus had therefore been sent by the true God to kind of put humanity back on the straight and narrow. And he proposed that there should be a very finite number of scriptures. So the Gospel of Luke, Acts of the Apostles, some of the letters of Paul, basically. And this is a key moment, because I think you can already by this point talk about Orthodox Christians who embody the kind of the mainstream of, or at least the kind of the central gravity in the church. They do not follow that. But because of this challenge, they have to decide what is the canon going to be, what are our scriptures going to be, and they choose the 4 Gospels because these are the ones that are the most closest to the time. They're the ones that are generally accepted as being the most authentic record, and the various letters of Paul and the Book of Revelation and so on. And they also decide to keep what they come to term the Old Testament, and the sense that God had prefigured the coming of Christ in the Hebrew Scriptures. And by doing that, it sets up opportunities for Christians to emphasize things that perhaps aren't being emphasized in the passion narratives. Let's put it like that.
Well, what I'm getting at, Tom, is let me put it more bluntly. You're very eloquent and a historian. What I'm saying is, in my understanding...
Why have Christians behaved in a monstrous way throughout history?
For example, I guess what I'm saying is, my experience of Christians today is that if somebody stood up and went, you know what, these people are heretics and they must be eradicated, most Christians would be like, well, that's a bit much. Do you know what I mean?
Well, that's been a long process of weathering and transformation. And the thing is that Christianity isn't it's a constantly... it's best thought of, I think, as a kind of civilization. You would, things evolve and change, and different emphases are happening all the time.
But this is why I'm asking, because when you talk to Christians today, they will say, compare it to Islam, right? If you say, well, Islam is not as drastic today as it was when it was first created, probably true, and process of weathering is perfect explanation to my layman understanding. You probably rip into this, right? But with Christianity, there was the message of compassion and empathy and turning the other cheek and all of that from the beginning. So what is it that's being weathered over this 2,000-year period?
So go back to the issue of paradox. Paul in his letters, writing to the Galatians, so this is really, might even be among the earliest of letters, so right at the start of the Christian tradition. He writes to them and he says that in Christ, there is no Jew or Greek, there is no man or woman, there is no slave or free. So he's dissolving the traditional boundaries that have separated, the two sexes, the different peoples of the world, and the different social orders.
It's very progressive.
Well, he's saying in Christ Jesus. He's not... The world is fallen. These differences and what stems from these differences are part of the lot of the children of Adam and Eve. We're all part of this fallen world. That's the gist. But that in Christ, they will be dissolved. This is the heaven that is promised. Now, of course, it's like an acorn from which a great oak will flourish. And I would say that the assumptions that govern a liberal society derived from that. The idea that men and women have an inherent equality, that differences between peoples are iniquitous to emphasize. I mean, we'll come to slavery perhaps in due course, but the idea that there should be, I mean, you can see that there is no slave or free. It feeds in the long run into abolitionism. It feeds into the French Revolution, to the Russian Revolution. I mean, these are very, very long-term consequences. I mean, another metaphor, I love mixing up the metaphors, would be that is a grumbling of the earth, a grinding of the tectonic plates, and in due course, Tokyo gets drowned by a tsunami. It's that kind of, that's what it is. But right from the beginning, there is a problem with one of those in particular, which is Paul's assertion that there is no Jew or Greek. He writes, what he means is Judean or Greek. He is a Judean. He's from Judea. He is therefore a provincial like any other, there are all kinds of people, Judeans, Egyptians, whatever. And he's comparing them to the Greeks. And he's saying that the differences between Judeans and Greeks will dissolve in Christ, i.e. there will be a kind of universal brotherhood, sisterhood, whatever. However, famously, not all Judeans are keen on having their sense of distinctiveness dissolved into a kind of universal mush. And so they do not, in the main, follow Paul's exhortation to accept Christ as Lord. And that then means that there is a fracture point right from the beginning between people who will come to be defined as Christians and Jews. And that is obviously an incredibly dark shadow that has hung over the entire course of Christianity. But you can see how what seems to us a progressive message has kind of led to what we could also see as very dark consequences. And that is just one verse from one book of the New Testament, which in turn is part of, includes the Old Testament. There is a lot of material there that can provide sanction for a broad array of responses, and that can also set in train all kinds of trends that, would have seemed unimaginable in the 1st century AD.
Tom, is that why, so everyone can drink? So my mother's Venezuelan, and it's really fascinating to see the way that the Spanish conquistadors behaved in South America and the Portuguese Empire behaved in South America. And they come from a Catholic tradition to the way that the British Empire behaved. Was that a large part of the way they behaved based on religion, or was there something else to it?
Well, the Spanish are the first to discover great powers in a world that no one had imagined before. And so when they conquered the Aztec Empire and then the Inca Empire, I don't know if you played, a game like Civilization.
I played Colonization, which is very problematic.
But Civilization,
it was a great game.
Civilization, you could end up with tanks attacking archers.
Yes.
And that's basically what you have, because the Aztecs is a kind of Bronze Age civilization. Yeah. Beautiful, fascinating, extraordinary, but collapses before everything that the Spanish bring, because they're the kind of beneficiaries of thousands of years of Eurasian, crops and cattle and all kinds of things like that. And this and obviously the Spanish interpret this as an expression of kind of God's plan. They're bringing Christ to people who had previously walked in darkness.
If you're someone who values free inquiry and independent thinking, which, let's be honest, is why you're probably watching Trigonometry, then our sponsor, Venice AI, is the tool for you. Here's a hot take. AI is exploding right now. But seriously, most of the tools out there are just clones with slightly different skins. Venice AI is different. It offers uncensored AI chat, images, and coding. Why should a team of programmers at these leading AI apps be the ones who get to decide what is and isn't okay for you to think? Whether you're researching topics that make other platforms nervous, or you're just sick of being told what you can and can't ask, Venice gives you the freedom to explore without limits. No political filtering, no condescending footnotes, just powerful AI, fast. We've tried it ourselves, and if you're someone who thinks about these things, you'll notice the difference immediately. If you want to use AI without fear of handing over your thoughts, ideas, or personal information to a corporation or the government, you can get 20% off a pro plan using our link, venice.ai/trigonometry. You'll find the link in the description of this episode, or type it in venice.ai/trigonometry and see what you've been missing. And now, back to the show. Sorry to interject very briefly. How much of it was that, were they genuinely seeking to expand in the New World for religious reasons, or was there a lot of pragmatism to it, you know?
Obviously it varies. I mean, the conquistadors are unbelievably brutal in the main. And if they hadn't been brutal, then they wouldn't have done what they did. You know, they wouldn't have conquered what they ended up conquering. The lust for gold becomes notorious. It is absolutely about wanting material goods, but to imagine that the desire to win souls for Christ is simply cynical window dressing is that's a very anachronistic take. There are absolutely people who are going out there who feel that this is absolutely part of God's plan, and there are friars, of whom the most famous is a guy called Bartolomé de las Casas, who condemns the oppression and the greed of the conquistadors as an offense against God. And there is a great kind of scholarly debate in Spain between those who are drawing on Greek philosophers, particularly Aristotle, to essentially, the strong do what they will, the weak must suck it up kind of argument, that there are those who are destined to be slaves and there are those who are destined to be masters. And they're drawing on Greek philosophy for that. And then there is Las Casas who's saying, no, he's drawing on the Gospels. He's saying, slavery is an evil. These are people who are as worthy of respect as anyone else who has been won for Christ. They must be won for Christ. And you can see there the beginnings of kind of ideas that will feed ultimately into kind of notions of international law. And that's a Catholic perspective. The British obviously are Protestant, and therefore they bring a slightly different perspective. One perspective is that the Spanish are evil. So what they call the Black Legend, the idea that the Spanish are uniquely appalling, which is often they're drawing on Las Casas and other Spanish writers like him to kind of condemn the Spanish. I mean, it's very much kind of Protestant black propaganda, I think. But the British have their own route to deciding that slavery is wrong. It's as Christian as the Spanish one, but it's distinctively Protestant. And what you have with the kind of radical form of Protestantism that develops in England in the Civil War and then the Commonwealth and its aftermath is this notion that the Spirit descends on you and enables you to read Scripture in the way that it's meant to be properly understood. So the simple words on the page, this is inadequate to properly understand it. You have to have the Spirit. You have to have been granted grace by the Spirit, by God. And when you do that, then you can see what it properly means. And this revolution in England is transported to the Caribbean, and it's transported to the American colonies. And so Quakers are the most obvious example, but Baptists and people like that. And this coincides with the development of plantation slavery in the Caribbean and in the American colonies. And Britain is starting to industrialize by this point, and industrialization is about utilizing resources in a way that is more intensive than has ever been done before. And what that means for slaves is obviously horrendous, because you industrialize the process of transporting slaves, of exploiting them, of working them. So you have the conjunction of that, the industrialization of slavery, and the this radical notion that you can only understand God's purpose by reading the scriptures with a sense of the Spirit. And it combines to inspire in Quakers and evangelical Anglicans a sense that slavery is wrong, even though famously, notoriously even, nowhere in the Bible does it say that slavery is wrong. Slavery is taken for granted in the Bible because it's seen as, in the way that hunger is, or poverty or homelessness or whatever. It's just part of the human condition. But radical Protestants in the 18th century and then into the early 19th century are saying, no, actually, it may not say this, but I feel the Spirit is telling me slavery is wrong. And it spreads like a wildfire. And the Spirit is conceptualized by Christians as fire, Pentecostal fire. So it's literally this kind of Pentecostal fire blazing across the Atlantic in Britain, in the Caribbean, in the North American colonies, particularly in the northern colonies. And it inspires the first great activist movement in Britain. You have people writing to their MPs. You have demonstrations going through the streets of London demanding the abolition of slavery. And it becomes so unignorable for the government that in 1814, Napoleon has been defeated and sent off to Elba. There's this Congress in Vienna to redraw the map of Europe. And Lord Castlereagh, the Foreign Secretary, has to go to Vienna and basically says, guys, I'm really sorry, but I've got all these guys who are, people in London who are holding street demonstrations and things. We've got to sort this out. We've got to abolish the slave trade. And this carries on even, through Waterloo and the second defeat of Napoleon. And the Protestant tradition that Castlereagh is representing obviously means nothing to the Catholic powers, to the French, to the Spanish, to the Portuguese. So they draw on those traditions that Las Casas had been articulating. So Catholic traditions, and it gets blended with the Protestant traditions, and so also do the radical traditions of the Revolution, the French Revolution, kind of the radicalism of that, because the French Revolution had abolished slavery in the Caribbean, and then Napoleon had brought it back in. So so essentially, it's a pooling of these three traditions, all of which are bred of the marrow of Christian Europe. The Protestant, the Catholic, and the kind of the Enlightenment tradition, if you want to call it that. And this is what gives birth essentially to the concept of international law, the idea that there are principles that transcend religious doctrine, so that a Protestant and a Catholic can equally accept the dictates of international law. And this is what enables British ships, when they are patrolling the Atlantic, that gives them the legal right to stop Portuguese or Spanish slave ships and arrest those who are doing it and, say, put them on the coast of Cuba and try them under international law. And it also provides a rubric for what then happens in the 19th century when the British start to go on the attack against the Muslim slave trade, because, of course, Muslims have very different sanctions for slavery. And so the process by which Muslim powers come to accept that slavery is an evil kind of requires them to accept the primacy of international law, which is a massive, massive deal for Muslims because they have a framework of law that derives supposedly from God. So it's much trickier for them than it is for Christians, because Christians don't have that notion of a God-given corpus of laws that have come from God. But essentially, that is the framework of international law that governs, upholds notions of human rights and so on to this day.
Tom, when you were talking about the fact that it was a religious movement that spread like wildfire that helped to eradicate, for the British Empire to stop using slaves and to eradicate slavery in the empire, it made me think, and I'm only going to touch on it briefly, with the way that the woke movement talked about slavery and how we were the beneficiary of slavery, which to a certain extent we are. But the way they talked about it was in the form of original sin.
Yes.
We are born into this sin and we are never going to be washed clean, and it is an indelible stain on our reputation and fundamentally our souls as well.
Well, so I think what happens is that slavery comes to be seen as the great sin. I mean, it's clearly a monstrous, appalling crime. But we judge that by Christian standards. We accept it as an appalling crime because we have bought into the assumptions of Las Casas or the Quakers or whatever. It's if you look at the entirety of global history, it's not in any way a moral given. Civilizations have always depended upon the exploitation of the masses, and that could be chattel slavery of the kind that you have in Greece and Rome, and then in the Atlantic in the 18th century, or it could be founded on caste, the idea that certain people are born to be inferior, or it could be upon the exploitation of proletariat, which you get in the 19th century industrial civilization. You always, there is no form of civilization that is not also a reflection of barbarism. Is the kind of the famous quotation. I'm paraphrasing, I can't remember it exactly, the Walter Benjamin comment. So there's always been exploitation. The idea that slavery is therefore not just an unfortunate corollary of the way of things, but a moral stain that has to be eradicated is very, very novel. And because it happened in a uniquely horrible form in the Atlantic, and because it was Christians who drove that, to a degree it contaminated, I think, the kind of Christian record in the eyes of people who were themselves absolutely saturated with Christian assumptions. And it kind of bled into anti-imperialism, moving into the 20th century. Again, the idea that the powerful countries shouldn't dominate weaker countries. I mean, most, the history of the world is basically the record of empires. The idea that empires are problematic, to use a favorite phrase of the woke, is again a relatively recent one. And it's meant that Christianity, which is a universal religion, Christians believe that it's for the good of the world that everyone becomes a Christian. There are more Christians more Christians than any other kind of practicing ideology in the world. That has come to be seen by lots of people as itself evil. The kind of the evangelical impetus of Christianity is seen as going out and overthrowing the right of the Aztecs to do what they want, even if that is human sacrifice or whatever. And so the consequence of that is that today we remain the heirs of these Christian impulses, the notion that slavery is an evil. But Christianity has been implicated in that, and so therefore the institutional character of Christianity is often rejected as part of the problem, of part of what has to be rejected, even though it is that institutional structure that has provided people with the ideological framework that enables them to judge it as evil. And so I think what you saw in 2020 and its aftermath was a deeply Christian movement. I mean, something that the Quakers in the 18th century would have recognized. The kind of the line of descent from the activism of Quakers in the 18th century is very, very clear. That's what they're doing. But because they have jettisoned the Christian scripture, the Christian practice, the Christian self-identification that had provided structure for the Quakers and the early activists, they essentially have to construct their own traditions. And so that's why you had all the toppling of statues, which is kind of very Protestant thing to do, toppling idols, taking the knee, people, offering themselves up for, as penitentials, white people. It's very, very, these are very, very Christian forms of practice. It's just that they have been divorced from the institutional framework that gave them birth. And so how and where they're developing is unclear. And I think that they are clearly mutating very fast, because once you unmoor ideas and stories and traditions from the context that gave them birth, they can mutate very, very quickly.
It's very interesting you mentioned that, because we had a super viral, very popular interview we did with a journalist called Richard Miniter, in which we talked about some of the ideas from Albion Seed, the idea of how the United States became what it became. And one of the things he explained to us, I think this may have been off camera, was how many of these woke ideas originate from the very areas of America where the Quakers would have once settled. Very interesting. But moving on, Tom, one of the other great religions that I think we are incredibly uneducated about, and I speak for myself above anyone else here in the Western world particularly, is Islam. And it's becoming a bigger conversation politically and societally because of immigration policy, because the number of Muslim followers of Islam in the Western world is growing. And I'd love to know more about how that religion came into being. What are its core values? What are its principles? You mentioned some of them already, but can you expand on them?
Could I just, before I do that, just put Islam in the context of the kind of the Christian story,
of course,
as manifested in the present West? Because I think that's important to understand why there are tensions between Islam and Western secular liberalism, and why there is such a reluctance to acknowledge this on the part of enthusiasts for secular liberalism. Because essentially what Christianity has that Islam does not is a concept of the secular. And this goes right the way back to ultimately, I mean, you can trace it to the story of Jesus being asked whether taxes should be paid to Caesar. You know, and he's famously asked for a coin, and there's the picture of Caesar, and he says, whose head is this? And he says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's. And so that sense that there is...
You're talking about the separation of what the Americans call church and state.
And they and we call it here church and state. You know, the notion of church and state, there isn't synagogue and state, there isn't mosque and state, it's church and state. And in the West, that's because this notion of there being two rival orders gets enshrined by the towering theological genius in the Latin Church. Augustine, great in North Africa in the late 4th, early 5th century AD. And this is against the backdrop of the collapse of Roman power. Rome has been sacked. And there are Romans who say, this is because we have rejected the old order, the old customs that enabled us to keep the gods on side. So, you know, going back to that stuff I was saying about Athens, these rituals, these festivals are like kind of insurance payments to keep the gods happy. And now we've abandoned these. And the Romans call these religiones. So a sacrifice or a festival in honor of a god is a religio. It's a bond that joins you to a god, and is a kind of guarantee that this god will then look after the city. And these religiones have been abandoned. And Augustine says, no, not a bit of it. And the reason for that is that everything in the fallen world is bound upon what he calls the cyculum, which is basically the span of human life, but it means the notion that everything is doomed to pass away. All things must pass, as George Harrison would put it. And he says that this is true of empires as well as of individuals. Rome is not permanent. Rome has no special significance. It will pass away. It is bound upon the cyculum. If you want eternity, you must bind yourself to the pure eternity of heaven. That's what the real religio is. And it's only the church that can give you this religio. So there you have, as the Roman Empire falls, this notion of there being an order of the cyculum, the order of religio. And over the course of medieval history, this becomes institutionalized. And going into the kind of the Reformation and into modernity, it mutates to become this idea that there is this space called the secular, which is kind of neutral. It's separated from what has come to be called religion. And this is a mad idea. No other culture has ever had this idea. So when you read about, ancient Greek religion, they had no concept of religion. And they certainly had no concept of religion as being something that is separate from the kind of the everything else. It's, the relationship of people to the gods is like the gin in a tonic. You can't separate out the gin and the tonic. What Christianity does is to say, yeah, you can have gin and here's the tonic and you can separate them out. That's the madness of the way that we conceptualize the world in the West. And Islam that has no concept that you can separate this out. And so this means, therefore, that what we have in the West is an idea that you have freedom of religion. And Jews in the 19th century had freedom of religion in the wake of the French Revolution. They are told, you know, you can practice your religion as you want. Jews didn't have religion. They were a people. But they're being told, if you want to become the citizens of the French Republic, that's brilliant. But you can no longer define yourself as a citizen of Israel. You know, you are now a French citizen who practices what comes to be called Judaism as a religion. And so Jews in the 19th and in the 20th century have to adapt their traditions to fit this very specific modern Western secular template. And Western secular democracies require Muslims to do the same, to conceptualize what they belong to as being a religion. But classically, that's not how Muslims understood it. Islam is a totalizing way of leading your life. There are rules that govern every aspect of your existence. God is manifest in everything that you do. The idea that there are kind of safe spaces where everyone can meet up and kind of join in a secular space is something completely alien. And I don't think that most kind of enthusiasts for liberal secularism understand this. They tend to, I think they think that the notion of the secular is something that is common to everybody. That it's kind of like, you know, everyone has a sense of what a tree is, everyone has a sense of what a dog is, everyone has a sense of what the secular is. They don't. And so Muslims are being forced when they come to the West, are being forced into this kind of Procrustean bed of the secular notion of what a religion is.
The only reason I keep trying to interject is I'm trying always to convert what you're saying into simpler, more easier to understand language. And I guess what you're saying is the central tension there is, theologically speaking, Islam doesn't allow the separation of politics and Islam. If you are a Muslim...
Well, classically it hasn't.
That's why I said theologically speaking. There are, of course, individual people who are able to do so. But within the way that the religion is, if you follow that faith, then that faith controls everything. It controls the way you participate in society, the way you live your life, and the way you might vote in a society. Your loyalty will be to that above other things. Is that fair summation?
Ought
to be according to the doctrine. All right, people, it's trivia time. Financial trivia, to be exact. Do you know what retirement asset grew the most in the first 6 months of President Trump's second term? Many of you probably guessed the stock market was the best, since what's backing the most retirement accounts in America today is that. But from January the 21st through July 21st, the Dow Jones grew less than 1%. What about Bitcoin? President Trump loves Bitcoin, so it must have performed well, right? Well, it did. It grew nearly 15%, an impressive 6-month investment. But it's not the number one. The heavyweight champion was, wait for it, gold and silver. Gold and silver are considered to be safe haven investments, so many of you will be surprised to learn they both grew by a whopping 25% in President Trump's first 6 months. 25% in 6 months. Not bad for safe haven investments. Our partners, Augusta Precious Metals, specializes in helping Americans move wealth and retirement into self-directed IRAs backed by physical precious metals like gold and silver. They are consistently scored as the most trusted gold IRA company by major financial publications, and they enjoy an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau. In a world where governments print money and rack up debt like it's going out of fashion, I like assets you can hold in your hand. That's why I've always taken steps to secure my family's future with gold. If you have over $100,000 in your current IRA, 401k or other retirement account, visit triggergold.com, that's triggergold.com, to learn how Augusta Precious Metals can become your lifelong self-directed IRA partner.
As classically understood, Muhammad is the seal of the prophets. He has brought God's last message. And the Quran is a record of humanity's disobedience to prophets. Prophets arrive, they reveal God's wishes, they then ignore it or they corrupt God's message or whatever. And so more prophets have to come. Muhammad is the last prophet. He and what he teaches mankind is mankind's last hope. if Islam goes, then mankind is doomed. Everyone will go to hell. So it's absolutely, existential stakes. And the proof that that Islam is true, again, classically, is that Islam is triumphant for most of its existence. I mean, it pulverizes the Sasanian Empire, it dismembers the Roman Empire, conquers vast swathes of the Christian world, the kind of ancient Christian heartlands of Mediterranean Christianity. And it's really only with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt at the very end of the 18th century that Muslim powers are suddenly brought up against the fact that the despised Christian powers are incredibly powerful. And over the course of the 19th into the 20th century, most Muslim powers come under either the direct or the indirect hegemony of Christian Western powers. And so that's a massive, massive shock. And it requires a recalibration of what Islam is. I mean, the attitude to slavery would be a classic example. The reason that the Sultan in Constantinople is willing to contemplate banning the slave trade, even though it had been legitimized by the fact that Muhammad had slaves and that the early caliphs, they were all in favor of slavery. They thought it was brilliant. And that it's mandated in Islamic scriptures. The only reason he was willing to do that was that he needed the help of the British and the French in the Crimean War against the Russians. And so he essentially kind of employed his top scholars to try and work out a way in which, this Islamic law could be squared with this radical new notion. Mm. And this has been part of the kind of the great trauma for Muslims in the modern world is how do you adapt it? And essentially what Muslims did was to kind of Protestantize themselves. So they slightly adopted the sense that, it's in the heart. It may say this in the Quran, go out and crucify people who are offenders against God. But what that actually means is that you should try and be kind to them. I mean, that's the kind of, it's the...
So this is the people who say jihad is the internal
jihad
struggle.
Which it that is a part of it, but it's not...
The entirety of it.
It absolutely is not part of it. But yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so you have you look into your heart, and therefore you can adjust and adapt the legacy of Islamic scripture for the modern world. Get on the right side of history, all these kind of very Protestant ideas. Or the counter reaction to that is again a very Protestant one, which is to go fundamentalist, because in 20th century Protestantism, you have Protestants who are faced with Darwin and all this kind of stuff. And they say, we've got to go back and interpret the scriptures literally, which neither Christians or Muslims had ever really done. They have very, very sophisticated, complicated, almost poetic understanding of the scriptures. But fundamentalist Protestants were saying, well, what does the Bible say? It's inerrant. That's what we're going to do. And so Muslims also have adopted that policy. And the consequence of that has been a kind of very brutal understanding of Islam, because there's quite a lot in the Quran and in the Hadiths and in the life of Muhammad that, if interpreted in a kind of brutally literal way, sanctions quite a lot of bloodshed. And so that's part of the problem.
Well, quite. And this is so informative, Tom. I'm so glad we're talking about this, because I'm really keen to understand this from a deep perspective. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you about in this context is, how is there a unique challenge for Islam to, you call it Protestantize itself, which is to start to develop an interpretation that's more compatible with modern reality, for a number of reasons. One of them being the Quran is the literal word of God and the last word of God. This is the kind of the problem. You can't have a Reformation if this is it, right? Like you can't challenge any of it.
I think Islam is uniquely indigestible for a secular mindset. And people don't want to admit that, in a way, because there's a default assumption that secular civilization can swallow anything up. There's a kind of arrogance there. The secular civilization of the West is such a broad tent that everyone can be brought into it. But Islam is at least as sophisticated a civilization as the civilization of the Christian West, and a very ancient one, and for most of its existence has been much, much more powerful than the Christian world. And therefore, the idea that it should accommodate itself to what liberal secularists think it should do isn't a given. So Muslims in say, in a country like Britain, have freedom of religion. But there are lots of Muslims who do not see Islam as a religion because they see religion as a Christian category. Islam is much more than a religion. It's something that saturates every aspect of existence, and therefore they don't necessarily want that. They want to live in a world where, as has traditionally been the case, Islam is everywhere. But that is obviously something that the liberal state is not prepared to offer. So there are limits to what secularism and liberalism can and will offer.
So what's the obvious question is, and I mean, it's probably an unfair question to ask a historian, but where's this going?
I don't know. I'm not a prophet, unlike Muhammad. I mean, my guess is that Islam, rather in the way that Judaism has done, will accommodate itself to the host society. I mean, that's traditionally what happens, but that there will always be kickback because of what makes Islam distinctive. And also, obviously, the more Muslims there are, the more weight their voices will have. And so the more under pressure the secular assumptions of the West will come. And I don't quite know, I don't know where that will go.
Because, I mean, the worry for a lot of people is it's not necessarily Islam, it's that kind of very hard extremist edge of Islam that we see in this country. And if you go, will that remain? Will it ever be weathered? And these are impossible questions to ask. Because I think that's a worry for a lot of people, Tom, is that...
Yeah, I think it is.
And if there's no reformation possible, then is this just a continuation?
Well, I think Islam, to a degree, has had a reformation, because the Reformation is all about going back to scripture and getting rid of the kind of accretion of what's seen as superstition. And Islam has repeatedly been doing that. It's a constant kind of summons to reform Islam. And so certainly, the ideologues of the Islamic State would say that they were reformers. That's why they, for instance, completely dismiss any notion of international law. It's why they dismiss notions of human rights. It's why they think that slavery shouldn't just be allowed, but should be positively encouraged, because it's in the Quran, and therefore, if you want to be true to God's message, you should have slavery. I mean, that's a very, very radical minority position, but it is an example of the direction of travel that a certain understanding of the Islamic inheritance can lead people in. And of course it's a worry.
But I find this conversation very valuable, actually, because what you are actually explaining, that even people who go, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in God, I don't believe in Jesus Christ, I reject all of that, but you are still a product of Christianity.
Yes.
And as a result of that, you look at the world, whether you accept it or not, through Christian eyes.
Yes.
And I don't think that people quite understand what that means, particularly when we look at religions like Islam, or we look at other cultures and we're like, we're all the same.
Yeah.
We're not.
Well, so that is the foundational principle of whatever our new religion is. This kind of, this gelded, mutated, be kind, isn't Paddington wonderful kind of post-Christianity. That remains the kind of the dominant ideology. And I would say that the paradigmatic pulpit that this religion has is Thought for the Day on Radio 4's Today programme, where you will have Catholic priests and Anglican bishops and rabbis and Islamic scholars and Sikhs and Hindus, all preaching exactly the same message. You know, one will give it a little bit of garnishing from the Gospels, one from the Quran, one from the Bhagavad Gita or whatever. But basically, it's the same core message. And the idea, you know, and this is.
And what is that message? Be kind, diversity.
Be kind. It's brilliant. Yes,
yeah.
we're all basically the same. There are many routes to God. There are many paths up the mountain.
Isn't that all true?
No, I don't think it's remotely true. I think that what the study of history reveals, and it's why it's so fascinating, is the infinite number of ways there are to be human, and the infinite number of ways there are to order a society. And that at any given time, the majority of people who live in a particular place at a particular time will assume that their way of doing things is obviously the standard way of doing it. Why wouldn't you do it? And that's as true of Athenians in 5th century Athens as it is of us today in 21st century Britain. We just assume that the way we see the world is the way that the world is, but it clearly isn't. And you just have to look at the world through the eyes of, Protestants in the 18th century, or Muslims in the 14th century, or Aztecs in the 15th century, to realize and to try and see the world through their eyes, and to realize how relative one's own cultural assumptions are.
I mean, it's a very powerful point. I guess the next logical question is, we've got this new religion, whatever this is, as you've said yourself, but to me it doesn't seem more a religion. It seems kind of a mishmash of ideologies with no real...
But that is what religions are.
Yeah. I take...
You know, that's...
But there is no God.
But there is no God. And what I was trying to say is it doesn't seem to be a core. And I guess my question...
So it's floating away.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I guess my question is, unpleasant as it may seem, is can society last without this core to it?
We will find out. I mean, I would say...
That's an optimistic answer.
I mean, I would say that there are... I mean, that there are many, many paths, and many paths that our society will take, because it's fracturing in all kinds of ways. You know, there are many, many different perspectives. And those aren't just political, they're cultural, all kinds of ways. But I would say that, say, for Britain, this ancient Christian country, one path is that this kind of post-Christian Paddingtonism, if you want to call it that, it's like the head of the rocket. It's gone through the atmosphere. Everything else underneath it has been jettisoned, and now it's got the power to blast through the solar system. And all that kind of all the stuff that's been jettisoned is all the nonsense about the Bible and Jesus and the church.
It's just baggage.
It's just baggage. It's gone. It's drifted. It's detritus. We have now blasted out, and we're going forward. And the secular principles, the liberal principles, are sufficiently self-evidently right and good that it will sustain the future evolution and development of our society for decades and centuries to come. And therefore, you know, it's culturally determined. I mean, it's clearly derives from Christianity, but you don't need Christianity anymore to kind of provide the rocket fuel. It's going on its own way. Another option, which the history of the 20th century suggests, is that the default assumption among humans is that strength and might is right. Power does have a glamour, and this is what Nietzsche predicted. You know, he said when Christianity goes, there will be this great convulsion, and there, you know, it will be terrifying powers will emerge. And of course, he was right, because they emerged in the form of fascism, and fascism and Nazism cast such a shadow over us that we've lived in their shadow. In a way, one of the reasons I think for the decline of institutional Christianity is that Hitler has taken the place of the devil, and that a modern liberal now, rather than ask what would Jesus do, as his Victorian forebear would have done, says what would Hitler do and does the opposite. And that's kind of kept us on our liberal straight and narrow. But that is clearly fading as the experience of fascism in Europe becomes dies out, lived experience of it. So the kind of the bogeyman power of Hitler will fade, and people who are no longer bounded by Christian inhibitions or assumptions, I can imagine them turning around and saying, well, what's wrong with, why shouldn't I do what I like? I'm very rich, I'm very powerful. Why shouldn't I do exactly what I like? And it's not obvious what the answer to that is, I think, if you don't have the kind of the Christian answers. And I suppose a third possibility is that people will return to the source and say, well, actually, maybe I am Christian. Maybe I should take this a bit more seriously than I have been. And there are I think tentative signs that might be happening.
What's fascinating is I would argue there are signs of all three of those things happening at once.
Of course, and that's what I'm saying, is that all of these things might be happening. Of course, we will also have the growth of Islam, so that also provides a fourth option. And quite how all these different traditions will cope with each other. I mean, it's going to be interesting.
But doesn't it also?
He seems very excited about this for reasons that are beyond him.
I think we are living through one of the.
You're going to get some fascists. You're going to get the rise of Islam. You're going to get these woke idiots running around ruining everything. And what was the other one? The resurgence of Christianity. I mean, that's the one I'm.
So I think
most happy
I think we are living through a great choke point in the history of this country and of this continent more generally.
And Western civilization.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of British history, we've had periods where the culture of, say, just looking specifically at England, has radically changed. So the Norman Conquest, the Reformation, the Industrial Revolution. I think that we are on the verge of going through something similar now.
Brilliant.
And I don't know where it's going to go.
Yeah.
But people in 1790, looking at Birmingham or Manchester, would have had no idea where that was going. But everything changed, and maybe we're on the verge of going through something similar now.
Well, at least you said it with a smile on your face,
yeah,
Tom.
Brilliant.
But I was going to say just one thing. Doesn't this talk about an arrogance of our culture? But
all cultures are arrogant.
Right. I was going to say that.
Yeah, but they are. But aren't we especially arrogant to think we can divorce society?
No, that's your arrogance showing, mate.
Yes.
Am I not really special about thinking I'm special?
Yeah, I am special. The mother said so. But no, she didn't. But I was going to say...
Explains the comedy career, mate.
But thinking that we can... Surely, aren't we the only society that has ever thought we can divorce culture and religion?
Yes.
And
we are.
Is that not arrogant?
Yeah, it is arrogant, but the arrogance, people would say that's justified because of the fact that we have the most we're the products of an incredibly advanced civilization that industrialized, and therefore basically we've got the answer. And I think obviously that now rubs up against all kinds of anxieties about Western exceptionalism. But I think it does, the idea that our secular liberal society is uniquely advanced. I mean, to be progressive is itself a very Western thing. And if you're progressive, you're progressing ahead of everybody else. I mean, a sense of arrogance is baked into that word, I would argue.
Well, it's going to be a very interesting time. Tom, thank you so much. It's always such a pleasure speaking with you. We're going to ask you a bunch of questions from our supporters, which they've submitted. But before we do, what's the one thing that we're not talking about that we really should be?
Before Tom answers a final question, at the end of the interview, make sure to head over to our Substack. The link is in the description where you'll be able to see this. What's required in the character traits of a historian to engage hostile audiences with their most controversial academic insights?
Is Christianity's resurgence in the West a response to Islam's growing presence?
What has Tom changed his mind about during his career?
Have you talked about the cultural and social significance of sport on your?
We have not.
No.
I think that because we've just had this incredible climax to a cricket series, and I went on the Today programme this morning to talk about it, and was reminded. I went to the Oval yesterday where it was played, and the sense of tension was unbearable. And I'd been through this quarter-final in the Champions League where Villa, who we were talking about earlier, had played against PSG, and that also had been so excruciating. And I realised that these are the two moments where I have lived most fully this year. And that is, I am just one person among millions, perhaps billions, who share in experiences like that. And it is obviously part of an enormous, vast, global, industrialized construct. I mean, it's enormous. And the way that this has evolved, the fact that we take it for granted, it suddenly struck me, this is very odd. This is something I've always taken for granted that actually is very, very strange and unusual. So maybe something on that.
Excellent. Head on over to triggerpod.co.uk where we ask Tom your questions. Apocalyptic millenarian cults have played an important part of Western Christianity's history and culture. Do you see any similarities in today's movements which would indicate the emergence of such cults in the present day?